past 50 years, the number of people living on Earth has more than doubled. In 1960, the world population was 3 billion. According to the United States Census Bureau, the world population exceeded 7 billion on March 12, 2012. This year, we set the highest recorded human population in history. Thanks to medical advances, better sanitation, and increase in productivity, people have been living longer lives with more energy to reproduce. This steady increase in population has had huge economic and human rights benefits, and also inspired much creation and innovation. Socially, for people, this phenomenon may be beneficial, but how has it affected our natural resources, our relationship with the Earth, and the planet itself?
In a perfect world, the amount of resources needed to sustain life, like fresh water and food, would grow with the size of the population. But as we know, the Earth can only provide so much. And as the world's population continues to grow, resources are increasingly being consumed. Because of this, there are many countries all over the world with dense populations and few resources.
I guess that food and water supply has been really affected by the increasing the global population, and especially in literally rural areas, like in the slums, the water pipes, to take water to the people is just open, and open sewage just flows into it, and so it's really contaminated, and this is the water that the people are drinking and that the little kids are playing in and bathing in and stuff, and so obviously that's really, I don't know, it's really scary because with the increasing population, more and more people are living in these slums. And I guess as far as food, it's also just kind of scary because so many people don't have food at all.
The biggest problem is the positive feedback loop overpopulation and dwindling resources causes. Population growth leads to an increase in food and water demands. Recently, the food scarcity has led to the invention of genetically engineered foods to help fill this gap between supply and demand. Not only do these foods help to feed the hungry, but they do so while taking up less land and reducing the amount of pesticides used. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, from 1991 to 2001, there were 919 million people worldwide who were undernourished. By 2010 to 2012, it dropped to 868 million.
Well, we need to be less destructive, meaning that we need to pay attention to what we're using, our resources that we're using. We need to we need to cut back probably on the water consumption. We probably need to cut back on our trash with the landfill. I would just say, again, it goes back to educating people so people understand the problems in how, what we do today in terms of whether or not we recycle. Recycling could be part of it. I mean, even though it's a global population thing, the more people you have in these areas, the less resources we have. So we need to be responsible, I think, is the big thing.
Beside food and oil, water is the most precious natural resource in the world. Fresh water is difficult to purify and extremely expensive to transport. 780 million people across the globe don't have access to clean water. Part of this is caused by urbanization. There are informal settlements all over the world, like slums, where the water is stolen from larger cities and used as sewage water, drinking, and bathing water, all coming from the same trenches. This has led to 3.4 million deaths annually from lack of water sanitation and hygiene-related causes.
Well, I guess people need things to live, and things come from the environment. And whenever you take things from the environment, you're going to leave it different than how it started. So in one way or another, it's going to affect things. And I guess maybe you can take things from the environment more sustainably or less sustainably, but it's certainly true that if you take more things, you're probably going to have more impact than if you take less things. Now, if you have people and you have people growing, you could have poor people growing in terms of numbers, or you could have rich people growing in terms of numbers, or you could have poor people growing richer. So it seems like the amount of stuff that we extract from the earth depends A, on how many people we have, and B, how much those people use. So I think that you can't think about population in the environment without thinking about how much pie people have on their plate, and how that pie, how much fruit was wasted in the production of that pie. So these are complicated things, and I think that population is definitely an important piece, but it can't be looked at absent waste, absent equity, and absent the politics of how people feel about waste and equity and things like that.
Because resources are so scarce, a lot of people have been talking about something called sustainability. Sustainability is basically when you take from the earth only what it can provide indefinitely. This means that fossil fuels that have been around for hundreds of thousands of years won't be burned, and sources like fresh water will be protected.
Global population, I think, it's the number one issue of our time. It is pretty much the cause of every problem we have ever faced as a society, and it's potentially our demise. I mean, we see it day in and day out. I mean, a lot of it's really interesting from an economic perspective. Try not to get too technical, but there's something called the Malthusian postulate, which is really interesting. It was developed in the late 60s, and it basically just talks about all the problems that population faces, talking about the relationship between exponential population growth and basically an arithmetic rate of increase in food supply, and the potential for drastic consequences when we have more people than we do have food. So of course, food is the first thing to look at, but as you were mentioning, health issues are very, very important, because everything is just, the fundamental idea that we look at from an economic perspective is that we have scarce resources. We have a finite amount of resources, and if we have an infinitely increasing amount of people, that there are limits that we're going to break, and then what happens once we break those limits. So I think that that's definitely in my opinion, that's the number one political issue of our time that just is not talked about at all. It's just, we always look at how we can amass more wealth, more resources, more stuff, without looking at that there's only a finite amount of resources, and every resource we take has a detrimental impact on people, especially in the global south. So I guess any more than that would probably be more technical. But
In addition from taking to the earth, increased population has given to the earth as well. With more people and more industrialization, the air quality has gotten worse. If you look over most major cities, you'll see a thick blanket of brown smog. This again goes back to the positive feedback loop. More people are living, so cities are getting too big. New cities are forming, which take up land and require more natural resources. The resources they need have to be transported to them from the big cities, thus leaving smog in the air from the vehicles transporting the resources. More children will be born into the new cities, and the cycle continues.
Well, with my background, I'm mostly an expert in the technology side of things, so I know a lot about new medical technologies and how they get sort of built and made in certain countries and then distributed to other countries. I think that with the increase in population, it's really driven more of a demand. There's a need for technology in these more remote parts of the world. So a lot of times the technology will get innovated in one part of the world, like the United States or elsewhere, and then there's this huge need for it where there's new populations arising. So there's a big boom in population, but the technology hasn't reached there yet. So I can see in this field that it's actually driving more medical innovation and also industrialization in those areas, which has a large impact just on making everybody's health better. So the more that there's a need in developing nations for these new technologies, the more there is a demand for people to continue to innovate them faster and better and get healthcare to these new regions.
The question that we're facing as a civilization really is the issue of global overpopulation. And it is probably the most unacknowledged environmental issue that we face today as a civilization. It's so-called third rail of environmentalism because no one really wants to talk about it. I mean, when is the last time you really engaged in a discussion about how many people are there on the planet? When's the last time we heard politicians who are in charge of managing our common shared resources discuss how many people there are and how many people we can support? In other words, what might be the limit? Is there a limit? And I haven't heard anyone say, at least in the last 30 years, that we're at a limit in terms of how many people the planet can support. Back in the 1960s, and of course if you've done your research, you know the population bomb was a book by Paul Ehrlich out of Stanford, raising the specter that the planet was going to overpopulate and run out of resources within a 20 or 30 year period. Well, we've passed that 20 or 30 year period. Ironically, anytime there's ever a pronouncement that we're going to go off the so-called population cliff, humanity figures out a new way to eke out more resources from the existing, such as, for example, the green food revolution of the 60s allowed more food crop to be grown. But we are actually now coming up to 7 billion people, and in the next 20 years that looks like 9 billion people. That would be okay if the planet wasn't already starting to push back. In other words, if global warming is not going to, if global warming predictions actually come to fruition, we're looking at a planet that's 2 to 4 degrees warmer, which means less area to grow food in order to feed the increasing population. So when are we going to get to the point when we say we have to have a global discussion about where the population is going? That's it on a global scale. Then you can break down each region. And this is where we come into a very sort of difficult political discussion, because it's not only population growth inside of a particular group of people, it's also immigration of people coming into an area, fleeing another area. Well, generally, why would they be fleeing another area? Because that area has been overpopulated and they're moving to a new place for more resources, better opportunities, enhanced lifestyle changes. So there's a drive here. But look at what's driving the immigration policy. It's a failing environment in the indigenous site. That's my particular point of view. Frankly, I purposely, as a youth, never had children for that very reason, is that it is a population bomb. And I didn't want to contribute to that. Because, look, I'm alive. My mother's alive. She's 96. If I had kids, they would probably be your age, 30, and they themselves would have kids. And maybe, let's just stop there. That would be 4 generations of my family alive at the same time. So when people talk about zero population, replace yourselves with your offspring, well, that's good as long as you leave the stage and your offspring then are the actors. But in my case, there would be 4 generations of Razans alive at the same time using 4 times the amount of resources that are only supposed to be used by my wife and myself. So you see what I'm saying? As health grows better, lifespans increase, people live longer, and the population is not dying off. Now that's just the tip of the iceberg, because there's other issues, such as us oldsters living longer and you youngsters coming on, and you're not having as many kids as the oldsters did. So the population ends up being skewed toward the larger numbers of older people and fewer numbers of younger people. And in fact, as you've probably seen in your research, countries like Japan and modern Asian countries don't have enough people to support the older people by taxes, by Social Security, by work like that.
Though population boom has been affected greatly by immigration, resources are still vanishing. It also doesn't help that politicians are doing nothing to help solve this problem. We can be done to protect Earth's precious and natural resources. The answer is sustainability. The more resources we use, the faster the cycle will go. If we only take what we need and use our resources wisely, we may be able to have an Earth that will last longer and in better shape for generations to come.